Miriam Hale was 62 years old when her son took her to a lawyer's office 3 days after her husband's funeral and asked her to sign away the only home she had left. The office smelled of paper, lemon polish, and rain drying on wool coats. Miriam sat at the end of a polished table in the same black dress she had worn beside Walter's grave. Her wedding ring hung loose on her finger, too large now for a hand thinned by months of lifting medicine cups and holding her husband through the long hours before dawn. Across from her, Evan slid a cream-colored folder toward her. "It's just practical, Mom," he said. Beside him, Claire stood with her purse tucked under one arm, wearing the careful expression of someone pretending kindness was not cruelty. They said the house was too much for Miriam now. Too many stairs. Too many taxes. Too many memories. In exchange, she could keep Walter's old 12 acres in New Mexico, a cracked adobe house, a collapsed goat shed, and a desert well everyone called dead. The lawyer looked at the map and cleared his throat. There's nothing out there but sand and a dry hole. But what nobody knew was that the dead well had not been dead at all. And the land they gave Miriam as an insult was waiting to give her back everything they thought she no longer deserved. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories about dignity and second chances mean something to you, like and subscribe, because this one begins with a woman everyone had already counted out. Long before Miriam Hale became a widow, she had been a girl who learned to carry water before she learned to ask for anything. She grew up in a narrow wooden house at the edge of a dry county road. Her father left when she was 9, taking his boots, his temper, and the truck with the good tires. He left no note, no apology, and not enough money for flour. After that, Miriam's mother saved everything. Bacon grease in a blue tin, clean jars on the windowsill, vegetable water in a dented bucket for the little garden behind the house. Neighbors laughed at that garden. They said nothing good grew in soil that hard. But Miriam remembered kneeling beside her mother in the gray morning light, watching her press 2 fingers into the dirt. "Don't call land dead too quickly," her mother whispered. "Some things are only waiting for someone patient enough to notice." Miriam did not understand the sentence then. She only understood dry soil under her nails, cold water on her wrists, and the way her mother could look at a wilted plant as if it still had a secret to tell. That was the first lesson life gave her. People would leave. People would laugh. People would call something worthless when they were too hurried to understand it. The second lesson was record-keeping. Her mother rarely argued with men who spoke over her. She only kept her own accounts in a little notebook beside the stove. Rain, flour, seeds, debts, repairs. Years later, Miriam would do the same. When she married Walter Hale at 21, she brought little into the marriage except 2 cotton dresses, a coffee can of coins, and the habit of writing things down. Walter repaired pumps, patched fences, and could listen to a pipe knock inside a wall and know where the trouble lived. One winter night, he found her at the kitchen table, writing by the yellow stove light. The page before her held neat columns: rainfall, grocery cost, seed order, medicine, repairs. Walter smiled from the doorway. "A woman who writes things down," he said, "is harder to fool." The next day, he brought her a brown leather-bound notebook wrapped in newspaper. One corner was scuffed, and the clasp had been repaired with wire. To Miriam, it looked like something a woman kept when she believed her thoughts deserved a place to live. She filled it for years. She wrote the first hard freeze, the last rain, the herbs that survived poor soil, and the places where weeds stayed green after everything else turned gray. Walter taught her how to prime an old pump, how to hear air trapped inside a pipe, and how morning stone could stay cool if something beneath it had held the night. None of it looked important from the outside. To Evan, their only child, it was all just dirt, chores, and old habits. "Why do you save all that?" he once asked. "Because waste is what people do when they think tomorrow is guaranteed," she said. He did not understand. For years, Miriam believed time would teach him gently. Then Walter got sick. At first, it was only a cough that stayed too long. Then the stairs became difficult. Miriam slept in a chair beside the bed so she could hear when his breathing changed. Pill bottles lined the kitchen window. Walter's work boots remained beside the back door. Evan started visiting more often, but not with soup or stories. He came with questions. Where was the insurance folder? Had Walter updated the deed? How much were the property taxes? Was Miriam sure she could manage the accounts? Claire came too. moving through Miriam's kitchen as if measuring it for another woman's life. One afternoon, Miriam found her taking down the wedding photograph from the hall wall. "I thought we could repaint soon," Claire said. "Freshen things up." Walter was still alive then. Miriam stared at the empty square on the wallpaper where the photograph had hung for 39 years. "Put it back," she said. After that, Miriam noticed everything. Evan lowering his voice on the porch. Claire asking which furniture pieces were antique. A bank folder left open on the dining table. The week before Walter died, he asked for the brown notebook. Miriam placed it on the blanket. Walter rested his hand over it. "There's land out west," he said. "That dry piece in New Mexico?" Miriam asked. Walter's mouth moved like he almost smiled. "Your father would have called it dead," he said. "Your mother would have listened longer." Then his strength faded, and the sentence remained unfinished. 3 days after the funeral, Miriam came downstairs to find a cream-colored envelope beside her untouched breakfast. Walter's empty chair sat in its place at the kitchen table. Miriam opened the envelope. Inside were the papers that would break her life open without making a sound. The envelope did not look cruel. That was what Miriam remembered most. It sat beside her plate with her name written carefully across the front, the way Evan had written thank you cards as a boy when she made him sit at the kitchen table after Christmas. For a long moment, she only stared at it. The house was still. Walter's chair remained pulled back from the table. His reading glasses sat beside the salt shaker. His blue work coat still hung near the back door. Every object seemed to be waiting for him to return and make sense of the morning. Miriam opened the envelope with a butter knife. Inside were folded papers, a short note from Evan, and a business card from Mr. Albright, the lawyer who handled property matters in town. "Mom," the note began, "we need to discuss practical arrangements. Not grief. Not your father's things. Not how are you sleeping. Practical arrangements." Evan wrote that the house required upkeep, taxes, insurance, and decisions Miriam should not carry alone. He had scheduled an appointment that afternoon, so they could protect the family from unnecessary strain. The family. Miriam folded the note and placed it on the table. The kettle began to scream before she realized she had turned it on and forgotten why. By noon, Claire arrived without knocking. She carried a garment bag, a stack of mail, and the confidence of someone who had already decided what belonged where. "Oh, Miriam," she said, looking at the black dress. "You're wearing that again? It's clean." "I know. I just thought something lighter might help." Miriam did not ask what it was supposed to help. The dead were beyond clothing. The living were beyond pretending. Claire laid the garment bag across a chair. "Evan is under a lot of pressure," she said. "He's trying to do right by everyone." Miriam looked at Walter's empty chair. "Everyone?" Claire's face tightened, then softened again. For years, Miriam had tried to love her daughter-in-law in the quiet ways available to her. She had brought soup when Claire was sick, hemmed curtains without being asked, and never mentioned the way Claire's smiles changed when other people entered the room. But grief had thinned Miriam's patience. "This is my house," she said. "Of course," Claire answered quickly. "No one is saying otherwise." But people often said otherwise without using the words. They said it by opening drawers, asking where papers were kept, lowering their voices in hallways, and describing a woman's life as a problem that needed management. That afternoon, Evan drove her to Mr. Albright's office. He did not turn on the radio. Miriam sat with her brown notebook in her purse, and Walter's ring pressing lightly against her own. The town passed in familiar pieces. The pharmacy, the feed store, the church steps still damp from rain, the diner where Walter used to order coffee too strong. Evan kept both hands on the wheel. "You know I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. Miriam watched the road. "Then what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to keep things from falling apart." The sentence landed badly. Miriam had spent 40 years keeping things from falling apart. Roof leaks, broken pumps, sick animals, bills paid late but paid, Walter's shaking hands during the last month of his life. She had held so many pieces together that no one noticed the house still standing was proof of her strength. But Evan spoke as if she were the crack in the wall. At the lawyer's office, Claire was already there. So was the folder. So was the map. Mr. Albright greeted Miriam with professional sympathy and explained that Walter's estate contained complications. Some assets were easier to transfer than others. It would be best, he said, if the main house passed into Evan's management before taxes and repairs became burdensome. Management. Miriam heard the word and felt something inside her close. Evan leaned forward. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. We'd handle the house. You could stay for a little while until we figure out what's best. For whom? Miriam asked. The room went quiet. Claire placed one hand over Evan's. No one wants to rush you. But the papers were already printed. Mr. Albright slid another page forward. It showed a parcel in New Mexico, 12 acres outside a small desert town Miriam had visited only once. She remembered heat, red dust, a cracked adobe house, and a rusted well cover. Walter had stood beside that well years ago, looking down as if listening for something beneath the stone. Evan tapped the map. This would remain yours. Completely yours. Dad always kept it separate anyway. Claire added, it might be good for you. Quiet. Simple. Less to maintain. Miriam looked at the faded parcel lines. You mean the dead well? Evan gave a small laugh. Well, yes. Nobody's pretending it's valuable. Mr. Albright adjusted his glasses. The property has no verified water access and no current agricultural use. The structures are in poor condition. In other words, worthless. Miriam's fingers rested on the edge of the paper. She remembered Walter in the last week of his life, pale against the pillow, his hand on her brown notebook. Your father would have called it dead. Your mother would have listened longer. She did not know whether it had been warning, memory, or fever, but she knew this. The house she had cooked in, cleaned, repaired, warmed, and prayed inside was being taken from her one polite sentence at a time. Miriam picked up the pen, not because she believed them, not because she forgave them, but because the room had shown her the truth. She no longer had a home there. Not if staying meant becoming a guest in the life she had built. Before she signed, she looked directly at Evan. If I take that land, she said, do not ever tell me later that I misunderstood what you gave away. The signing took less than a minute. That was the strange part. 40 years of meals, repairs, birthdays, sickness, laundry, winter fires, planted bulbs, and whispered prayers could be reduced to a few pages and a line of ink. Miriam wrote her name slowly. Miriam Elaine Hale. The pen scratched against the paper. Evan watched the letters form. Claire looked down at her phone, pretending not to watch. Mr. Albright gathered each signed sheet with the careful hands of a man who had learned that pain was easier to handle when it was kept in folders. When it was finished, the lawyer slid the New Mexico parcel documents toward Miriam. These confirm your separate ownership of the western property, he said. 12 acres, existing structures, well site, and access road. I should state again that the well is listed as non-producing. Dead, Claire said softly. Miriam looked at her. Claire's cheeks colored. That's what people call it. Miriam folded the papers and placed them inside her purse beside the brown notebook. Evan exhaled as if something difficult had finally been handled. I think this will be better, he said. Once things settle. Miriam stood. For a second, she felt the full weight of her age in her knees and hands. Then she remembered her mother carrying water before sunrise, with no one to praise her for it. I'll need my things, Miriam said. Of course, Evan answered. There's no hurry. But there was hurry in everything that happened next. By the time they drove back to the house, Claire was already making lists. She spoke from the back seat about estate sales, storage units, repairs, and simplifying. Evan nodded without meeting Miriam's eyes. At the house, Claire walked in first. That small act told Miriam more than any paper had. Claire entered as if she belonged there. She set her purse on the counter, opened the cabinet for glasses, then moved through the rooms with a notepad, touching lamps, frames, side tables, and the old quilt folded over the sofa. Miriam went upstairs alone. In the bedroom, Walter's side of the bed was still untouched. On the dresser sat a pocket knife and the little tin where he kept odd screws, because he believed every screw would eventually find its missing place. Miriam took one of his work shirts from the closet and pressed it to her face. Soap, cedar, and the faint ghost of machine oil. That was all. She sat on the edge of the bed until the hallway floor creaked. Evan appeared in the doorway. We don't expect you to decide everything today, he said. You already decided enough. He flinched, but not deeply. Some truths only bruised people who still allow themselves to feel them. Miriam pulled 2 suitcases from under the bed. One had a broken wheel. The other had belonged to her mother. What are you doing? Evan asked. Packing. You don't have to leave tonight. No, Miriam said. I have to leave before this house learns to look at me like a stranger. He had no answer for that. She packed practically. 2 dresses, work pants, socks, Walter's shirt, a wool sweater, the brown notebook, her mother's small spiral notebook, brittle at the edges, a tin of seeds she had saved more from habit than hope, a folding knife, a packet of letters tied with blue thread. Downstairs, Claire was standing beside the dining room hutch. "Some of this furniture may need to stay with the house," she said gently. Miriam walked past her to the kitchen. She opened the bottom drawer and took the few tools that had always been hers: pruning shears, a hand trowel, twine, a small hammer with a cracked handle, and Walter's old pump wrench. Claire's smile faltered. "Do you think you'll need those?" Miriam placed the tools in a canvas bag. "I think I'll need what still knows how to work." Evan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it has to be." Miriam turned, and the room seemed to draw in around her. The worn table, the stove, the window over the sink, the place where Walter used to stand drinking coffee before sunrise. "You made it hard when you printed the papers before asking me." Evan opened his mouth, closed it, and looked away. That evening, Miriam carried her suitcases to the front porch. The rain had stopped. The boards were damp under her shoes. Across the yard, the maple tree Walter had planted when Evan was born moved gently in the wind. Claire stayed inside. Evan followed Miriam out and held the car keys. "At least let me drive you to a motel. I can drive myself. You shouldn't be alone." Miriam almost laughed, but the sound would have hurt too much. "I have been alone in this house for months," she said. "You only noticed today because I stopped being convenient." The words landed between them. Evan looked suddenly younger, like the boy who once came into the kitchen with a scraped knee and expected his mother to know what to do. For one aching second, Miriam wanted to spare him. Then, she remembered Walter's photograph, removed from the wall while he was still breathing. She took the keys. The car was old, the trunk too small, and the road ahead longer than she wanted to imagine. She loaded the suitcases herself. Before she left, Miriam walked back to the porch and placed her hand on the doorframe. She did not say goodbye to the house. A house was not just boards and nails. It knew who had washed its floors, who had risen in the dark to light its stove, who had stayed when staying was hard. But houses could be taken by paper. Land, she thought, could also be misunderstood by paper. She looked once at Evan. "If you ever come to that desert," she said, "come as my son, not as a man checking on property." Then Miriam got into the car, placed the parcel map on the passenger seat, and drove away from the home she had kept standing for 40 years. At the edge of town, she stopped at a gas station with flickering lights and bought a bottle of water, a sack of apples, and a cheap road atlas. The clerk asked where she was headed. Miriam looked through the window toward the dark western road. "New Mexico," she said. The clerk raised his eyebrows. "Long way to go alone." Miriam tucked the receipt into her notebook. "Yes," she said, "but it is mine." Miriam did not drive straight into New Mexico that night. She stopped at a roadside motel outside town, where the sign buzzed blue against the dark and the curtains did not quite close. She carried both suitcases inside, set Walter's work shirt on the pillow, and spread the parcel map across the bed. 12 acres. A cracked adobe house. A collapsed goat shed. A dead well. The words should have frightened her. Instead, after the lawyer's office, they felt almost honest. The land did not pretend to love her while taking her home away. It made no promises. It simply waited on paper, dry and far away. By morning, Miriam had made a plan. She sold the car for less than it was worth, because quick money always had teeth. With the cash, she bought a bus ticket west, kept a folded portion inside her brown notebook, and arranged to rent an old pickup near the last town before the property. The bus carried her through long miles of thinning green and widening sky. Farms became fences. Fences became scrub. Scrub became red earth and pale grass bending under wind. At every stop, people stepped down into waiting arms. A daughter called for her mother. A man kissed his wife beside a vending machine. A boy ran toward his grandfather's truck. Miriam stepped down only to stretch her knees, buy coffee, and check the papers in her purse. No one waited for her. On the second afternoon, the land changed completely. The air grew sharper when the bus doors opened. Mesas rose in the distance like old stone ships. The sun seemed larger there, less forgiving. Dust moved along the road in thin, restless lines. Miriam pressed her hand to the window. She had come through this country once with Walter, many years before. He had driven with one hand on the wheel, pointing out dry washes, leaning windmills, and cottonwoods that marked hidden water. Desert doesn't shout its gifts, he had said. It makes you prove you're not just passing through. She had laughed then. Now she understood why he had spoken with respect. The bus left her in a small New Mexico town with one diner, one feed store, a church with a white cross, and buildings faded almost colorless by sun. Wind pushed dust along the curb. Somewhere, a loose sign creaked against metal. A mechanic named Luis rented her a battered pickup with a cracked dashboard and a passenger door that had to be lifted before it shut. When he saw the address, he raised his eyebrows. "You're going to the Hale parcel?" Miriam folded her hands over the map. "Yes. Everybody knows that place. Because it's valuable?" He gave a short, dry laugh, then caught himself. "No, ma'am. Because nobody ever managed to do much with it." He pointed out the route with a grease-dark finger. Paved road to the old cattle crossing. Dirt track after that. Third gate on the left. Avoid the south wash. If the wind rose too hard, stop and wait. Then, as she turned to leave, he added, "There used to be a woman out there long ago, Abigail Mercer. Folks said she grew things where nothing ought to grow." Miriam looked back. "What happened to her?" Louise shrugged. "Desert keeps its own records." The sentence followed her out of town. The paved road ended in a sudden strip of broken asphalt. Beyond it, a dirt track ran into open land, the color of rust. Miriam stopped the pickup and stepped out. The silence was enormous, not empty silence. Living silence. Whined through brush. Dry grass ticking against itself. The small metallic ping of the truck cooling behind her. No cabinets opening. No voices lowered in another room. No one deciding what she could keep. For a moment, the space frightened her so deeply that she almost turned back. She thought of a motel room, a church office, a shelter in some other town. Any place with walls that did not ask so much courage from an old woman with 2 suitcases. Then she looked at the parcel map on the passenger seat. "It is mine." The words did not make her fearless. They only made her get back in the truck. The road worsened quickly. The pickup bounced over ruts and stones. Twice, Miriam opened wire gates and closed them carefully behind her. Once, the front wheels dipped into a dry wash so sharply that her suitcase slid hard against the door. She stopped, breathing fast, hands tight on the wheel. Then she laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because fear had become too heavy to carry without sound. Near the third cattle guard, she saw something strange. A strip of brush curved across the land in a line too smooth to be random. The plants were gray and tough, but thicker than the brush around them. Beneath them, the soil looked slightly darker, as if it had once remembered water. Miriam slowed. Her mother would have stopped. Walter would have knelt and touched the ground. But the sun was dropping, and the wind had begun to lift sand across the track. Miriam marked the curve in her mind and drove on. The house appeared suddenly. It sat low against the red earth, a tired adobe shape with a crack running down one wall. The roof sagged in the middle. The door leaned crooked in its frame. To one side, the goat shed had folded into itself, boards silvered by weather. Beyond it, circled by stones and rusted metal, stood the well. The dead well. Miriam turned off the engine. Dust slid past the windshield. For a while, she remained seated with both hands on the wheel, looking at the place her son had given her because he believed it had no use. The house looked wounded. The shed looked forgotten. The well looked sealed by heat and years of being ignored. But Miriam had seen worthless things before. She had seen hard soil grow beans. She had seen old jars hold winter food. She had seen a quiet woman keep a family alive, while louder people explained what could not be done. She opened the truck door. Her shoes sank slightly into red dust. The wind pressed her dress against her legs as she lifted the first suitcase from the truck bed and faced the house. It was not welcome, not yet, but it did not tell her to leave. And after everything Miriam had lost, that was enough for her to walk toward the door. Miriam reached the door just as the last light slipped off the roof. The wood was swollen in its frame. When she pushed, nothing moved. She set down the suitcase, braced one shoulder against the panels, and tried again. The door groaned, scraped the floor, then opened with a dry sound that seemed to come from the bones of the house. Warm dust breathed out at her. Miriam stood on the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room was small, square, and nearly empty. A table leaned against one wall. A chair lay on its side. Mud-colored plaster had fallen from a crack near the ceiling. In the corner, a nest of dry grass shifted as something small ran for cover. She did not scream. She had lived long enough to know that panic used energy a woman might need later. Instead, she carried her suitcases inside and set them near the wall, least damaged by weather. Then she opened every window she could force open. One stuck halfway. One had no glass left in the frame. Wind came through carrying grit, but it also carried air, and the room began to feel less like a tomb. The adobe house had 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen at the back. The bedroom held a metal bed frame with no mattress, a cracked wash basin, and a trunk too light to contain anything useful. The kitchen was worse. Mouse droppings lined the shelves. A blackened stove squatted under a pipe that disappeared through the roof. The sink had a hand pump beside it, but when Miriam worked the handle, it gave only a hollow cough. She tried 3 times. Nothing. Outside, the well waited in its ring of stones. Miriam took the bottle of water she had bought at the gas station and placed it on the table. It looked suddenly small. She drank only 2 careful swallows, then screwed the cap back on. Not all at once, she told herself. The first work was not repair. It was clearing space enough to survive the night. She swept broken plaster into a pile with a broom she found behind the stove. She shook dust from the old chair and tested each leg before sitting. She used Walter's pocket knife to scrape mouse-chewed cloth from a cupboard. In the trunk, she found 1 wool blanket, stiff with dust but whole, and a coil of twine wrapped around a wooden peg. By sunset, Miriam had made 1 corner of the room livable. Not comfortable. Not safe in any permanent sense, but livable. She ate an apple from her bag and a piece of bread she had bought in town. Every bite felt loud in the empty house. When darkness came, it came quickly. The desert outside turned blue, then black. The temperature dropped hard enough that Miriam pulled Walter's work shirt over her dress and wrapped the old blanket around her shoulders. Wind moved through the broken window and tapped a loose shutter against the wall. She slept on the floor with her purse under her head and the brown notebook against her chest. Several times in the night, she woke thinking she had heard Walter breathing. Each time, there was only wind. Near dawn, cold woke her for good. Her knees ached when she stood. Her back protested. For one sharp moment, she saw herself from the outside, an old woman in a ruined room, with dust in her hair and nowhere else to go. Then sunlight touched the floor. It entered through the broken window in a narrow gold line and landed on the table where she had placed the parcel papers. The sight steadied her more than comfort would have. The papers were still there. The land was still hers. Miriam opened her notebook and wrote the date. First morning. House damaged but standing. Stove possible. No water from kitchen pump. 1 blanket found. Wind from west. Check well. Writing the words made the day feel like something she could answer. After a breakfast of the last apple and a mouthful of water, she went outside. The property looked harsher by daylight. The goat shed had collapsed inward, but beneath the fallen boards, she found a length of rope, a rusted bucket without a bottom, and a shovel with a cracked handle. The yard was scattered with tin, wire, broken clay, and thorny weeds that grabbed at her skirt. The well stood beyond the shed. Its stone ring was lower than she remembered, half buried by blown sand. A rusted metal cover lay over the opening, weighted with 2 flat rocks. Miriam cleared brush with the pruning shears, cutting slowly to save her hands. She pulled away dead grass, then paused. The air near the stones felt cooler, not cold, not wet, but different. She stepped back, then leaned close again. The morning was warming quickly, yet a faint breath seemed to rise from the cracks around the cover. Miriam frowned. She removed one of the rocks. It was heavier than expected. The second nearly slipped from her hands, and she had to sit on the well ring until the dizziness passed. She was not 20. She could not pretend strength worked the same way at 62. When she lifted the edge of the metal cover, hinges shrieked and a smell rose up. Dust, rust, old stone, and something deeper she could not name. She held still, listening. No splash, no clear sound of water, only depth. Miriam took a pebble from the ground and dropped it into the dark. It fell long enough to make her stomach tighten. Then came a sound from below, not the sharp crack of stone, not the dead knock of dry earth, but a soft, distant touch. Mud, perhaps, or water too far down to see. She closed the cover again, not from disappointment, but from caution. There was work to do before she trusted anything that deep. By midday, heat pressed against the house. Miriam moved slowly, resting when her breath shortened. She cleaned the stovepipe with a branch wrapped in cloth. She gathered dry mesquite twigs and old boards too rotten for building, but good enough for kindling. Under the sink, behind a fallen panel, she found 3 jars, 2 chipped plates, and a small tin of matches sealed tight enough that half still struck. That discovery felt like mercy. At dusk, Miriam lit the stove. The first flame was weak and smoky. She coughed, adjusted the pipe, opened the cracked kitchen door, and tried again. The second flame caught. Orange light moved over the walls, softening every broken place it touched. Miriam warmed water in a dented pot, enough to wipe her face and hands with a cloth. She saved the gray water in a bowl and carried it outside to the north wall, where she had noticed a stubborn bush with silver leaves growing from a seam in the hard earth. She poured slowly. The smell rose at once, sharp and clean. Sage? Miriam knelt beside it, touching one leaf between finger and thumb. It was alive, scarred by wind, half buried in dust, but alive. She looked from the sage to the well, then to the faint curved line of brush she had seen from the road. The place was broken. It was lonely. It might still defeat her. But as evening settled over the red land, Miriam felt the smallest shift inside herself. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large a word for one flame, one blanket, one possible sound below a covered well, and one living sagebush. But it was something. And for the first time since Walter died, no one in the world could tell her to leave. On the second morning, Miriam woke before the sun and did what she had done in every hard season of her life. She made a list. Not a hopeful list. Hope, she had learned, could make a person careless. This was a survival list, written in her brown notebook with a pencil worn flat on one side. Water remaining, less than half a bottle. Food, bread ends, 2 apples, 1 can of beans. Tools, pruning shears, trowel, hammer, pump wrench, cracked shovel, rope, shelter, 1 room usable. Fire, possible. Well, uncertain. She underlined the last word. Uncertain was not dead. After sunrise, Miriam carried the notebook outside and walked the property in slow circles. She did not have the strength to attack the place all at once, so she studied it the way her mother had studied hard soil. She marked the broken fence line. She marked the north wall where sage grew. She marked the odd curve of brush she had noticed from the truck. The curve bothered her. Most desert plants grew where wind and luck allowed. But this line bent across the land with quiet purpose, running from the low ridge north of the house toward the well. The plants along it were not lush. Nothing there was lush, but they were thicker and more stubborn than the scrub around them. Miriam knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the soil, and felt for coolness. At first, there was only grit. Then, beneath the top crust, the earth held together slightly longer than it should have. She wrote, "Soil darker under brush line." By mid-morning, heat began lifting from the ground. Miriam moved back to the well and cleared more brush from the stone ring. The metal cover had rusted in place along one side, but the flat rocks, holding it down, looked newer than the well itself. That was the first thing that troubled her. The second was the way the stones were arranged. Old wells had disorder in them. Hands repaired what weather damaged. A stone shifted here, another settled there. But 3 stones on the south side sat too evenly, their edges aligned like teeth. When Miriam scraped away sand with the trowel, she saw pale mortar tucked behind them. Someone had placed them there on purpose. She sat back on her heels. "Now why would you need closing up?" she whispered. The wind answered with dust. Miriam did not move the stones yet. At 62, she knew curiosity could be dangerous when it came faster than preparation. Instead, she went inside, drank 1 careful swallow of water, and searched the kitchen again. She opened every cupboard. She tapped shelves. She pulled out drawers and turned them over. Most gave her only mouse dust and splinters. Then, behind a narrow shelf beside the stove, her fingers found a groove. The board did not match the others. It was darker, thicker, and held by 2 crooked nails. Miriam used the hammer and Walter's pump wrench to work them loose. The first came out with a squeal. The second broke halfway, forcing her to pry the wood gently until it shifted. Behind it, she found no treasure, only the back of the adobe wall, scratched with words. They were faint, half hidden by dust, written by someone using the point of a nail or knife. Do not trust the dry mouth. Listen below. Miriam stood very still. The kitchen seemed to shrink around her. The stove, the cracked sink, the dusty shelves, the broken window, all of it became suddenly less empty, as if the house had not been abandoned so much as interrupted. She touched the words with 2 fingers. The carving was old. Dust had settled into the cuts, and the plaster around them had hardened with years. Do not trust the dry mouth. The well. Listen below. She copied the words into her notebook exactly. After that, every sound seemed sharper. The scrape of her shoes, the creak of the roof, the low moan of wind in the stovepipe. Miriam carried the notebook back outside and stood over the well. This time, she tied the old rope to a stone and lowered it slowly through the narrow gap beneath the lifted cover. The rope dragged against rock. Dust fell from the rim. She counted under her breath, hand over hand. At 20 feet, nothing. At 30, the rope swayed more freely. At 40, the stone struck something soft. Not water, not clearly, but not dry rock either. She pulled the rope back up. The stone was dark along one side, coated with a thin smear of damp mud. Miriam stared at it until her eyes burned. Mud meant moisture. Moisture meant the well had not been empty in the way people said. But a smear was not enough to live on, not enough to fight for, not enough to call anyone a liar. She needed more. That afternoon, she followed the brush line toward the ridge. The path was rough, and twice she stopped with one hand on her knee until the dizziness passed. Near the base of the ridge, the plants thickened around a scatter of stones half buried in sand. One stone bore a mark, not a natural crack. A small cross had been scratched into the surface, weathered nearly smooth. Miriam looked back toward the house. From where she stood, the marked stone, the curved brush, and the well formed a line. Her heart began to beat harder. She remembered Louise saying Abigail Mercer had grown things where nothing ought to grow. She remembered Walter standing by the well years ago, as if listening. She remembered her mother's voice. Some things are only waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Miriam knelt beside the marked stone and brushed away sand. Underneath was another patch of pale mortar. Someone had not simply abandoned this place. Someone had covered something, sealed something, hidden the truth of the land behind stone and silence. The sun dipped lower. A cold thread of wind moved down from the ridge. Miriam knew better than to pry deeper so near dark, with no one knowing where she was, and no water to spare. She placed the sand back over the mortar and returned to the house slowly. That night, she did not sleep well. The words behind the shelf waited in her mind. Do not trust the dry mouth. Listen below. Outside, the dead well stood under the stars, quiet as an old secret. And Miriam did not yet know that by touching those stones, she had touched the first edge of something others had tried to bury long before she arrived. At dawn, Miriam prepared before touching the stones again. She tore one of Walter's old shirts into strips and wrapped them around her palms. She checked the rope for weak places. She sharpened the cracked shovel against a flat stone until it was not sharp, exactly, but less useless. Then she set the last of her clean water in the shade by the doorway, where she could see it, and remember not to spend herself foolishly. Only then did she return to the well. The 3 even stones waited beneath their skim of sand. Miriam knelt and scraped around them with the trowel. Pale mortar showed between the edges. Not ancient, but old enough to have forgotten the hands that placed it there. She wedged the hammer into the first seam. Nothing moved. She changed angles and tried again. A thin crack opened with a sound like a tooth breaking. Miriam stopped and listened. The well did not shift. No stones dropped. No hidden collapse answered her. She breathed through the tremble in her wrists and worked the hammer deeper. By mid-morning, the first stone loosened. It was heavier than it looked. She rocked it until her shoulder burned, then pulled it free and let it fall onto the dirt. Behind it was not solid wall, but a dark gap packed with clay, roots, and chips of stone. Cool air touched her face. Miriam sat back quickly. The air did not smell like a dead hole. It smelled of wet stone. She whispered Walter's name, because he was the only person she had known who would have understood the size of that small smell. The second stone took longer. The sun climbed. Sweat ran down her back. Twice she rested in the shade. Twice she wrote down exactly what she had done, because records kept panic from becoming guesses. First south stone removed. Cool air behind. Clay packing. Possible side chamber. When the third stone came free, Old mud fell inward, and the sound rising from the well changed. It was faint, but she heard it. A trickle, not a stream, not a cheerful rush of water in open light. Only a narrow hidden movement somewhere below the stones, slipping through darkness. Miriam covered her mouth with one wrapped hand. Then she laughed once, and the laugh broke into something close to a sob. She did not let it carry her away. A trickle was not a life yet. A damaged well could kill a careless woman. A blocked spring could be ruined by greed as easily as drought. She needed to understand what had been done. Using the rope, she lowered a stone through the gap. This time, it dropped farther, struck something slanted, then slid. When she pulled it up, the lower half was wet, not muddy. Vet. Miriam pressed the stone to her lips before she could stop herself. The taste was mineral and cold. For the rest of the morning, she worked clay from the gap. The more she cleared, the clearer the shape became. Someone had carved a small service niche into the side of the well, then sealed it from above with stones and mortar. Inside the niche was a rusted iron hook. On that hook hung a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Miriam stared before touching it. The bundle was wedged high enough that floodwater had not reached it. Whoever placed it there had wanted it hidden, but not destroyed. Her hands shook as she loosened it. The oilcloth cracked at the folds. Inside was another layer of waxed fabric tied with cotton cord. Miriam carried it into the house before opening it, because some discoveries deserved a table and a roof, even a broken one. She set the bundle beside her brown notebook. For a moment, the two objects looked like they belonged to the same conversation across time. Inside the cloth lay a small journal, a folded map, 3 envelopes, and a packet of dried seeds gone pale with age. The journal cover was dark green, warped at the corners. On the first page, written in a firm, slanted hand, was a name, Abigail Mercer. Miriam sat down slowly. She read the first line aloud. If this book is found by someone who has been told this place is dead, believe your hands before you believe their mouths. Miriam looked toward the kitchen wall, toward the hidden words scratched behind the shelf. Do not trust the dry mouth. Listen below. She turned the pages carefully. Abigail's entries were not fanciful. They were records, rain dates, soil notes, planting failures, goat births, stone temperatures, water levels by month and year. She had written the way Miriam wrote, not to decorate life, but to survive it. There were sketches of the well's inner wall, showing a narrow channel feeding it from the north ridge. There were notes on a spring that did not run above ground but seeped through stone, slow and steady. Enough for a careful household, a small garden, and goats if no one wasted it. Then the entries darkened. Men from a private water company had started buying dry parcels around the valley. They told widows and old farmers the land had no future. They paid almost nothing. Later, when road plans changed, they searched the same worthless parcels for usable water. Abigail refused to sell. After that, her trough was broken. Her goats were let loose. Someone filled part of the well channel with stone. A county inspector marked the well non-producing, without testing the lower chamber. Miriam paused. Non-producing. The same word Mr. Albright had used. Abigail had reopened the channel once, then sealed the service niche with her journal inside because she feared someone would destroy the map if it remained in the house. Her last clear entry was short. They can call a well dead on paper. Paper cannot hear water. Miriam put the journal down and covered her eyes. She had not found treasure. She had found a witness. After a while, she unfolded the map. It showed the house, the well, the goat shed, the north ridge, and a thin faded line marked Stone Runnel beneath brush line. Beside it, Abigail had drawn 3 small crosses, one at the marked stone Miriam had uncovered the day before. The notes were precise. Clear upper blockage first. Do not widen channel. Let water settle overnight. Draw only 2 buckets first day. If water clouds, stop. Miriam copied every instruction into her own notebook. The value of the discovery unfolded slowly. The well was not a miracle. It was a system. A small, careful, fragile system that could live again if treated with respect. Water meant she could stay. Not easily, not extravagantly, but stay. It meant sage, mint, calendula, perhaps beans along the north wall. It meant tea, salves, dried bundles, something to sell at market if her hands held out and the land forgave her ignorance. One envelope was addressed simply, To the woman who comes after me." Miriam did not open it yet. She went back outside with the map folded in her pocket. The sun was lowering, and the well stones cast long shadows. She stood beside the opening and listened. There it was again, the trickle, small, stubborn, alive. That evening, Miriam followed Abigail's instructions exactly. She cleared only the upper blockage. She did not widen the channel. She did not tug at stones. She did not understand. When water began to gather at the bottom, faint and dark, she closed the cover halfway and let the well breathe. Inside the house, by stovelight, Miriam finally opened Abigail's letter. The paper was brittle, but the words remained. If you are reading this, then you are either desperate, stubborn, or both. Good. This land has no use for people who only love what is easy. Miriam smiled through tears. The letter described the herbs Abigail had grown. Desert sage for tea, calendula for skin, mint where the wall gave shade, yucca root for washing, chamisa bundles for winter scent. It explained how to dry leaves without burning them, how to label jars, how to trade small before trusting large buyers. At the bottom was one final line. This land will feed the woman who refuses to abandon it. Miriam read the sentence 3 times. Then she placed Abigail's journal beside her brown notebook and laid Walter's pump wrench across both, as if joining 3 hands at the same table. Outside, under the desert dark, the well made no grand announcement. No fountain rose. No river broke open. But far below the stone, water moved again through a channel someone had tried to silence. And Miriam Hale, sitting alone in a cracked adobe house with dust on her sleeves and tears drying on her face, understood that the first real inheritance of her widowhood was not land. It was proof that the dead thing had been waiting for someone willing to listen. By the 3rd morning, the well had changed. Not enough for a careless person to celebrate. Not enough to call the town. Not enough to fill barrels or boast at market. But when Miriam lifted the cover and lowered the rope, the stone came back wet on all sides. She sat on the well ring with both hands folded in her lap and cried without making a sound. Then she wiped her face, opened Abigail's journal, and did exactly what the dead woman had written. Draw only 2 buckets first day. The first bucket rose half full, cloudy with silt. Miriam did not drink it. She poured it into a shallow pan and let it settle in the shade. The second bucket came clearer. She filtered it through clean cloth, boiled a little on the stove, and tasted 1 careful spoonful after it cooled. Cold. Mineral. Real. Water. The word moved through her like a bell. For the next week, Miriam lived by measurement. 2 buckets. Then 3. Never more than Abigail allowed. She cleared only what the map instructed. She marked the water level every morning. She planted nothing yet except patience. But the land responded before people did. The sage by the north wall lifted its leaves. A patch of desert mint showed green near the shaded stones. The curved line of brush looked less gray. Miriam began tying small cloth strips to the places Abigail's map marked, not to decorate them, but to remember where the hidden runnel passed beneath the earth. On the 8th day, Luis drove out with a sack of beans, 2 tins of coffee, and a replacement handle for the old shovel. He stopped near the well and stared. "Well," he said quietly. Miriam looked at him. "Yes." He walked closer, removed his cap, and looked down into the darkness. "I heard folks say that well was dry since before I was born." "Folks repeat things," Miriam said. "Water does not care what folks say." Luis smiled, but there was worry in it. "Be careful who hears about this." By sunset, half the town seemed to know. It began with Luis, though he did not mean harm. A mechanic mentioned a wet bucket. A clerk mentioned an old widow on the Hale parcel. A waitress at the diner repeated it while filling coffee. By the next market morning, Miriam heard 2 women whisper behind her in the feed store. "They say the dead wells got water." No, that land was tested years ago. Maybe not properly. Miriam kept her eyes on the shelf of flour sacks. For the first time since arriving, people looked at her not with pity, but calculation. The first visitor came that afternoon. Evan's truck raised dust long before it reached the house. Miriam watched from the doorway as he stepped out, wearing clean boots that had never known real work. Claire got out after him, shielding her eyes from the sun, as if the land itself had offended her. "Mom," Evan called, too warmly. Miriam did not move from the shade. Claire smiled at the house, the well, the small neat pile of cut brush, the jars Miriam had washed and set along the windowsill. "You've done so much," she said. Miriam waited. Evan looked toward the well. "Louise said you might have found some water." "Might have." "That's wonderful," Claire said. "But also concerning. Water rights can be complicated." There it was. Not joy, not apology. Complication. Evan stepped closer. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Living out here alone, handling a well, dealing with legal matters. It's a lot." Miriam looked at the man who had given her the land because he believed it was useless. "It is less than burying a husband and being handed papers at breakfast." His face tightened. Claire's smile vanished for half a second, then returned. "No one is trying to take anything from you." Miriam nearly laughed. "You already did." The wind moved between them. Evan lowered his voice. "If there's real water here, the property may need to be reassessed. We should review the paperwork." "Ve? You're my mother, and this is my land." Claire glanced at the well again, then at the house, as if mentally repainting it, pricing it, removing Miriam from the picture. "We only want what is best," she said. Miriam stepped out of the doorway then, slowly. Not because she wanted to frighten them, but because she wanted them to see she could still stand. "You wanted me quiet and simple," she said. "You got the quiet, not the simple." They left after 20 minutes, carrying no papers, no promises, and no invitation to return. 2 days later, a second visitor came. He arrived in a white truck with a blue company logo on the door, Price Regional Water Services. The man who stepped out was broad, clean-shaven, and dressed for business in a place where business should have known better than to wear polished shoes. "Mrs. Hale," he called. "Gideon Price." Miriam had heard the name in town. Everyone had. Price bought failed wells, managed water access, leased tanks, negotiated rights. People spoke of him with the careful tone used for men who could make life easier or harder depending on their mood. He removed his sunglasses and smiled. "I hear you've had some luck." Miriam wiped her hands on her apron. Luck is what people call work when they did not see it happen. His smile paused, then resumed. "Fair enough. I respect hard work. That's actually why I'm here. A property like this can become a burden fast. Testing, permits, maintenance, liability. I'd hate to see someone in your position overwhelmed." "In my position? A widow alone on undeveloped land." He said it gently. That made it worse. Gideon offered to buy the parcel. Not for much. More than Evan had called it worth. Less than what his eyes said he believed it could become. Miriam listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "No." His smile thinned. "You should think about it." I did. Water can attract trouble. So can men who want it. For a moment, Gideon Price did not bother looking kind. Then, he put his sunglasses back on. "I'll be in touch." That night, Miriam slept badly. Near midnight, a sound woke her. Metal. Not wind. Not shudder. Metal against stone. She sat up on the floor, fully awake. The stove was cold. Moonlight lay pale across the table. Outside, something scraped again near the well. Miriam took Walter's pump wrench in one hand and the lantern in the other. She did not rush. Fear wanted rushing. She had no use for fear's advice. When she opened the door, a figure broke away from the well and ran toward the dark line of brush. "Stop!" Miriam shouted. The figure did not stop. By the time she reached the well, no one was there. But the rope lay cut on the ground. One of the flat stones had been shoved toward the opening. Fresh scratches marked the metal cover. Miriam held the lantern closer. Someone had tried to block the well again. For a while, she stood in the moonlight, breathing hard, the pump wrench heavy in her hand. Then she went inside and opened her notebook. She wrote everything: time, moon position, cut rope, scratches, direction of footprints, tire marks near the access road. Records, Walter had said, made a woman harder to fool. In the morning, she walked to the road and followed the tire tracks until they vanished in hard ground. Then she returned, tied a new rope, moved the loose stone away from the well, and boiled water for tea. Her hands shook only once. By noon, an old pickup appeared at the gate. This time, the driver was a woman with silver hair braided down her back and a face browned by sun. She carried a cloth bag in one hand and a walking stick in the other. "You Miriam Hale?" she asked. "Yes. I'm Rosa Medina." Miriam recognized the name from the feed store, from a jar of dried chile, from the way people said it with respect. Rosa looked past her toward the well. I heard Gideon Price came calling. He did. Rosa nodded slowly. Then you need to know something before he comes again. Miriam stepped aside and opened the door. For the first time since she arrived on the dead land, she let someone in. Rosa Medina entered the adobe house without looking surprised by its cracks. That was the first thing Miriam liked about her. Most people looked at damage as if damage were a kind of shame. Rosa looked at the broken window, the patched stovepipe, the swept corner where Miriam slept, and the jars lined along the sill, then nodded once, as if the house had introduced itself honestly. She set her cloth bag on the table. Inside were corn cakes wrapped in a towel, a small jar of chile, dried beans, and a bundle of herbs tied with twine. You'll need food before advice, Rosa said. Miriam almost refused out of habit. Pride rose quickly in a woman who had been treated like a burden. But hunger was older than pride, and Rosa's face held no pity. Thank you, Miriam said. They ate at the table while the desert brightened outside. Rosa chewed slowly, watching the well through the open door. My grandmother knew Abigail Mercer, she said at last. Miriam's hand stopped over the cup. Abigail was real then, as real as thirst. Rosa wiped crumbs from her fingers. People made stories out of her because it was easier than admitting they wronged her. Miriam brought out the green journal. Rosa did not touch it at first. She only looked at the name on the cover. Something in her face tightened, not with fear, but with memory inherited from people who had carried old truths too long. She grew sage and mint, Miriam said. Calendula, yucca root, and feverfew, Rosa added. My grandmother said Abigail made a tea that could calm a woman's nerves after childbirth. She traded fairly, never took more water than the land could spare. Then why did everyone say the well was dead? Rosa looked toward the doorway. Because men with papers said it louder than women with buckets. The sentence settled into the room. Rosa told the story in pieces. Years ago, families had lived scattered across the dry valley, each with a small well, a few animals, a garden if they were careful. Then water companies began buying parcels. They sent inspectors, made offers, frightened widows, and spoke of drought as if drought had personally hired them. Abigail refused to sell. After that, trouble found her often. Broken troughs, missing goats, a well declared non-producing, a road access dispute. People began saying she was difficult, then unstable, then foolish. By the end, Rosa said, folks remembered the rumors better than the woman. Miriam looked down at Abigail's journal, lying beside her own brown notebook. That, she thought, was another kind of death. Rosa stayed until afternoon. She did not take over. She did not say, move aside, let me show you. She stood near the well while Miriam explained what she had cleared, what she had measured, and what Abigail's map instructed. Rosa listened carefully. Then she said, You're drawing too fast by one bucket. Miriam frowned. Abigail wrote 2 the first day, then 3. Yes, in spring. Rosa tapped the page. This heat? Go slower. Miriam felt embarrassment rise. Rosa shook her head before Miriam could speak. Learning is not failure. So Miriam changed the record. 2 buckets only. Rest the well every 3rd day. Shade the storage jars. Keep the first planting close to the north wall, where morning shadow lasted longest. Over the next week, Rosa came twice more. She taught Miriam how to hang herbs where air moved but sun did not burn the leaves white. She showed her how to crush dried sage between her palms and smell whether it had cured properly. She brought empty paper packets and a spool of plain labels. Do not sell anything you cannot name, Rosa said. Miriam wrote each label by hand. Desert sage tea, mint and calendula blend, yucca root wash, Abigail's well balm. When she wrote Abigail's name, she paused. You think that's all right? She asked. Rosa's eyes softened. I think some names have waited long enough. The first market day came on a Saturday. Miriam nearly did not go. Her hands looked rough. Her jars were mismatched. The labels were plain. She had only a small basket of dried bundles, 6 packets of tea, and 4 tins of balm made from calendula oil. Rosa had helped her prepare. What if no one buys? Miriam asked. Rosa tied the last bundle. Then they will see. The market stood at the edge of town under white canopies that snapped in the wind. Miriam rented half a table from a woman selling eggs. She arranged her packets twice, then a 3rd time, then forced herself to stop touching them. People noticed her. Some looked curious, some looked amused. Some looked toward the white truck parked across the street, where Gideon Price sat behind the wheel, watching. Evan and Claire did not come, but their absence felt present. For an hour, no one bought anything. Miriam stood behind the table with her hands folded, feeling the old humiliation creep up her neck. She remembered Claire's voice saying quiet, simple. She remembered the lawyer saying no verified water access. She remembered Evan laughing softly at the dead well. Then, an older woman with swollen knuckles stopped at the table. "What's in this balm?" "Calendula, a little yucca oil, beeswax, and desert sage," Miriam said. "For dry skin, not medicine, just care." The woman opened the tin and smelled it. "My mother used to make something like this." She bought one. Then the egg woman bought tea. Then Luis came by and bought 2 packets he did not need, loudly enough for 3 people to hear. By noon, Miriam had sold half the basket. Not enough to live on forever. Not even enough to repair the roof. But enough to buy flour, beans, lamp oil, and a coil of new rope without touching the cash hidden in her notebook. More important, people began asking questions that did not sound like pity. "Where did you grow this? How much water does sage take? You really opened that old well? Was Abigail Mercer's place yours now?" Miriam answered carefully. "Yes, less than people think. With work, it is mine." Near the end of the market, a young county clerk named Daniel Ortiz approached the table. He wore rolled sleeves, tired eyes, and the cautious expression of a man who knew small offices could hide large wrongs. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly, "I pulled the parcel record after Mr. Price asked about it." Miriam went still. Daniel lowered his voice. "You need certified copies, ownership, water classification, access easement. Not because anything is wrong now, because people like him wait until something is missing." He handed her a card with his office hours written on the back. "I can't give legal advice," he said, "but I can make sure the papers say what they already say." Miriam accepted the card. "Why help me?" Daniel glanced at the packets on the table. "My grandmother bought tea from Abigail Mercer when she was a girl. She said that woman kept half the valley alive through a bad winter." Then he walked away before gratitude could embarrass them both. That evening, Miriam returned to the adobe house with an empty basket, a little money, and Daniel's card tucked safely inside her brown notebook. Rosa was waiting by the well. "Well?" she asked. Miriam held up the basket. Rosa smiled. It was not victory yet. The roof still leaked. The well was still fragile. Gideon Price still watched from town. Evan could still return with papers and concern sharpened into a weapon. But that night, Miriam lit the stove, counted her earnings, copied every sale into her notebook, and placed Abigail's journal beside it. For the first time, the work had not ended at survival. It had reached another person's hands. The letter from Price Regional Water Services arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was not addressed in Gideon Price's hand. It came typed, stamped, and folded into a white envelope that made the whole thing look official before Miriam even opened it. She stood at the kitchen table, Abigail's journal on one side, her own notebook on the other, and read every line twice. The company requested a public review of the Hale parcel's water status. It claimed the reopened well might affect regional water management. It suggested that an elderly private owner could not safely maintain an unregistered source. It recommended that the county consider transferring oversight to a licensed provider. Oversight. Miriam knew that word. It was a softer word for taking. At the bottom of the page was a date for a town hall meeting. Rosa read it after breakfast and made a sound low in her throat. "He wants to make you look small in front of people," she said. "He already thinks I am. No, he needs them to think it." That afternoon, Miriam went to Daniel Ortiz's office. He had already pulled the records. The signed transfer, the parcel description, the access easement, the old non-producing classification, and the forms required to amend it. "The well was never properly tested," Daniel said, tapping one yellowed page. "The inspector marked it, non-producing based on surface access only. No depth reading, no chamber inspection, no flow test. Can that matter?" "It can matter if you bring records." Miriam looked at her brown notebook. "I have records." Daniel gave a tired smile. "Then bring them." The meeting was held Friday evening in the old town hall, a square building with humming lights and folding chairs lined across a scuffed wooden floor. Miriam arrived early with Rosa beside her, carrying a canvas bag heavy with papers, jars, maps, and both notebooks. Gideon Price was already there. So were Evan and Claire. Miriam stopped when she saw them. Evan stood near the front row in a pressed shirt, looking uncomfortable but determined. Claire whispered into his ear and touched his sleeve. When Evan saw his mother, he crossed the room too quickly. "Mom," he said, "I came because I'm worried." Miriam looked past him to Gideon. "No, you came because someone told you worry could be useful." His face flushed. Before he could answer, the county chair called the meeting to order. Gideon spoke first. He stood with one hand in his pocket and the other resting on a folder. He praised Miriam's perseverance. He called her discovery inspiring. Then he began to turn praise into a cage. "Mrs. Hale is a grieving widow," he said. "She has done admirable work under difficult circumstances. But water is not sentiment. Water requires testing, infrastructure, oversight, and legal clarity. None of us want to see a vulnerable person exploited by a situation she may not fully understand." A few people nodded. Miriam kept her hands folded around the handle of her canvas bag. Then Evan stood. "My mother has always been independent," he said, "maybe too independent. Since my father died, she has been making decisions from a place of grief. I'm not saying she means harm. I'm saying she may need help." Claire looked down, as if saddened by Miriam's condition. That was when anger finally came. Not hot, not wild. A clean anger, like a blade wiped dry. The chair turned to her. "Mrs. Hale, would you like to respond?" Miriam stood slowly. The room quieted in a way that reminded her of the lawyer's office. People waiting to see if an old woman would tremble. She did tremble. Then she opened the bag. "No degree," she said, looking at Gideon. "No title, no company truck, just records." Rosa placed Abigail's map on the table. Daniel stepped forward only far enough to confirm the certified copies, then stepped back. Miriam noticed that and was grateful. He was not taking her place. She laid out the documents one by one. "This is the deed showing the land belongs to me. This is the access easement. This is the original non-producing classification. This is the page where the inspector failed to record a depth test." Gideon smiled faintly. "Mrs. Hale, old paperwork can be confusing." "It can," Miriam said. "That is why I read it slowly." A few people shifted in their seats. She opened Abigail's journal. This belonged to Abigail Mercer, who lived on that land before anyone in this room decided it was worthless. She recorded water levels for 12 years. She drew the channel from the North Ridge. She wrote down how the well was blocked after she refused to sell. Gideon's smile faded. "Personal journals are not official evidence." "No," Miriam said, "but they can tell you where to look." She placed her own notebook beside Abigail's. "These are my records from the day I arrived. Soil temperature, well depth, mud on the rope, first water level, draw amounts, rest days, changes in vegetation, every bucket." The chair leaned forward. "You measured every bucket?" "Yes." "Why?" Miriam glanced at Rosa, then at the room. "Because water is not a miracle. It is a responsibility." That sentence moved through the hall more strongly than a speech would have. Gideon cleared his throat. "Even assuming there is water, private management raises questions. A licensed company could maintain the source for broader benefit." "By buying it from me cheap?" Miriam asked. "That is not what this meeting is about." "It is exactly what this meeting is about." Evan stood again, voice tight. "Mom, please, you are turning this into a fight." Miriam faced him. "You gave me that land because you thought it was dead. Do not ask the county to protect you from the fact that I listened longer than you did." The words struck him silent. Claire rose then, smooth and pale. "We are only concerned because grief can make people attach meaning to things that are not practical. A ruined house, an old journal, a few herbs. It may feel empowering, but that does not mean it is sustainable." Miriam looked at her daughter-in-law for a long moment. Then she reached into the bag and took out a small brown packet. "Desert sage tea," she said. "Sold out last market. Another packet. Mint and calendula blend. Sold 8. Tin. Balm. Sold 4 the first week, 9 the second." She turned the labels outward. Each one bore the same name, written carefully by hand. Abigail's Well. "This is not a fortune," Miriam said. "It is not meant to be. It is work. It is food money, roof money, rope money, seed money. It is enough for one woman to begin." An older woman in the second row raised her hand. "I bought the balm," she said. "Helped my hands." The egg seller from the market added, "I've seen her sales sheet. She pays her table fee on time." Louise spoke from the back wall. "And I've seen the well. It's not a rumor. Gideon's face hardened. Community feeling does not settle water classification. Daniel stepped forward again. No, he said, but records do. Mrs. Hale has enough documented evidence to request a formal retest. Until that process is complete, there is no basis to transfer oversight to a private company. The chair looked at Gideon. Is there any existing claim from Price Regional on that parcel? Gideon's jaw tightened. No existing claim. Any unpaid lien? No. Any court order limiting Mrs. Hale's use? No. Miriam felt the room change. Not into applause. Not yet. Something quieter. The turning of a lock. The chair looked at her. Mrs. Hale, are you requesting formal retesting under private ownership? Yes. And do you intend to sell the property? The question hung in the hall. Miriam thought of the lawyer's table. Walter's empty chair. The first flame in the stove. The sound of water touching stone far below the earth. She thought of Abigail writing by lamplight, hiding a journal for a woman she would never meet. No, Miriam said. Gideon turned sharply. Mrs. Hale, refusing professional partnership could cost you. She met his eyes. Maybe. But selling what keeps me alive would cost me more. The chair nodded. Then the county will schedule a retest. Until then, the parcel remains under Mrs. Hale's ownership and care. There was no dramatic cheer. People in small towns rarely changed all at once. But the silence after the ruling did not belong to Gideon Price. It belonged to Miriam. Evan approached her as the chairs began to scrape. Mom, he said, his voice lower now, I didn't know. Miriam closed the canvas bag. You did not ask. Claire waited near the door, arms folded, saying nothing. Outside, dusk had turned the street copper. Rosa walked beside Miriam to the pickup. For a few steps, neither woman spoke. Then Rosa said, You stood well. Miriam looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. I was afraid. Rosa opened the truck door. Standing does not mean you were not afraid. It means you did not hand fear the papers. Miriam placed the bag on the seat and looked back at the town hall windows glowing in the evening. She had not won everything. The retest still had to happen. Gideon Price would not disappear. Evan's apology had not repaired what he had broken. But that night, in front of the town, Miriam Hale had said no. And the word had held. The retest happened 9 days later. Miriam woke before sunrise, tied her hair back, and wrote the date at the top of a clean page in her notebook. Outside, the desert was still blue with morning cold. The well stood in the half-light with its metal cover lifted, the rope coiled neatly beside it, and Abigail's map folded in a cloth pouch on the stone ring. 2 county workers arrived in a dusty truck. Daniel came with them, carrying a clipboard and a sealed folder. Gideon Price arrived 5 minutes after that, dressed as if the desert were a courtroom. Evan came too, alone this time. Miriam noticed Claire was not with him. No one said much at first. The county workers measured the depth. They lowered a testing line. They checked the side chamber Miriam had uncovered. One of them, an older man with sunburned hands, knelt by the south stones and studied the old mortar. This was sealed, he said. Miriam said nothing. Gideon crossed his arms. Old wells are often altered. The worker looked up, not usually by accident. They drew water slowly, exactly as Abigail's instructions advised. The first bucket came up clear enough to show the bottom seam. The second carried a little silt. The third was tested, labeled, and set in the shade. Miriam stood with her hands folded. She had expected to feel triumphant when others finally saw the water. Instead, she felt protective. The well was no longer a secret, and that made it vulnerable. By noon, the workers had finished their measurements. Daniel read the preliminary finding aloud. The well was active. Limited, but active. The prior non-producing classification was incomplete. The source was suitable for small domestic and agricultural use under restricted draw. Private ownership remained valid. No transfer of oversight was recommended. For a moment, the only sound was wind moving through dry brush. Then Gideon Price took off his sunglasses. This does not change the broader regional need, he said. Miriam looked at him. No, it changes what you can take. His mouth tightened, but he had no paper stronger than hers. Evan stood near the truck, staring at the well, as if it had betrayed him by being alive. After the county workers left, he walked toward Miriam. I thought I was doing what Dad would have wanted, he said. Miriam looked at the cracked adobe house, the patched window, the line of jars drying in the sun. No, she said quietly. You thought I would be easier to manage if I had less. He lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. She wanted the apology to repair something. It did not. It only placed a small stone where a bridge might one day begin. You can visit, she said, but not to inspect, not to advise, and not to ask what this place is worth. Evan swallowed. What should I ask? Miriam turned toward the well. Ask how it is doing. That was all she gave him. In the weeks that followed, the county issued the corrected classification. Daniel brought the certified copy himself, along with the amended water record and access easement. Miriam placed them in a tin box under the bed, beside Abigail's journal and her own first pages from the land. The next market Saturday, Miriam set up her half-table again. This time, she had more packets: desert sage tea, mint and calendula blend, Abigail's well balm, yucca root wash. Rosa sat beside her, pretending not to help while helping with everything. Louise came early and bought coffee-colored soap before anyone else could. The egg seller moved her crates over so Miriam could spread out. By mid-morning, a line had formed. Not a long line. Not the kind that makes newspapers. Just 6 people waiting patiently under the white canopy, each holding a few dollars, each looking at the packets with interest instead of pity. An older man bought balm for his cracked hands. A young mother bought tea for her own mother. A woman from the church asked whether Miriam might teach a small class on drying herbs without wasting water. Miriam wrote every sale down. At noon, Gideon's white truck passed once along the street. It did not stop. That felt better than applause. By the end of the day, Miriam had sold nearly everything. She counted the money twice, not because she loved money, but because each bill had a task attached to it. Roofing nails, window glass, more jars, a proper rope, seeds for the north wall, feed for 2 goats when the shed could hold them. Rosa watched her fold the bills into the notebook. You did well, she said. Miriam looked at the empty basket. I did enough. And enough, after being told she was too old, too alone, too emotional, too impractical, felt almost like abundance. The victory was not a mansion. It was not revenge. It was not Evan begging at her door or Gideon Price ruined in public. It was a corrected record. A well with water in it. A table where people came by choice. A label with a forgotten woman's name printed clearly on every packet. And Miriam Hale, 62 years old, standing behind her own work, no longer waiting for anyone to decide whether she had value.